Michael J. Fox, Celine Dion, Shania Twain, all Canadians who have become international stars. But they are all following in the footsteps of a poet and storyteller who at the turn of the last century was probably the most famous Canadian on the planet. And as Mike McCardle reports, if you'd like to pay your respects, you can in Stanley Park.
It is amazing that it ended like this, her face and her name carved in stone. A memorial to a woman who at that time was one of the most popular and well-loved in the English-speaking world. You sure would not have believed it in the beginning. Her grandparents on both sides said, "Poor Pauline, we hope she doesn't suffer. After all, she's the child of a mixed marriage. Her health isn't good, and, well, she is just a girl. The best we can hope for is she gets married at a young age." And even though her father was a chief, since she was born on a reserve, she was a ward of the British government. But she was too sickly to attend residential schools, so her English mother taught her at home. And she taught her well, and she taught her poetry. And Pauline also listened to the stories from her Aboriginal relatives, and then she turned the stories into poems, and some magazines in New York bought them. At a time when not much, at least not creatively, was expected of white women, and even less of Native women, and even less of women mixed Native and white, she was not so bad. She even wrote a little poem about this lagoon. When the tide went out, she called it the Lost Lagoon. She was pretty darn good with those words and images. She started going on speaking tours, first by wagon in Canada, then the U.S., then England, retelling the stories, poems, and comedy from both sides of her family. In her one-woman show, she wore buckskin with bear claws and feathers, then halfway through her talks, she would switch to high society dresses. Canada was a place like nowhere else in the world. People of nature with a silk dress. Pauline Johnson lived in a small apartment in the West End, but when she wasn't in there, she was here in Stanley Park, where she spent literally all of her time exploring it, loving it, and writing about it. When she was dying of breast cancer at 52, she had one wish: to be buried in the park. But there were rules against that. However, it was Pauline. This is her grave. She is officially the only person buried in Stanley Park. Her grave became a shrine. At the beginning of the last century, when people heard of Canada, they usually pictured Pauline. But like much fame, hers has faded. While she lived, she overcame prejudice without ever complaining and made a living by writing about the good parts of her life and her country. If they had only lived long enough, her grandparents would have said, "What were we worried about? We just want to brag about her now."
And if you are wondering where Pauline Johnson's gravesite is, it's in an alcove of trees near the Sequoia Grill at the Tea House, which is just south of 3rd Beach. And I bet she gets some visitors over the next little while.